Hi, everyone. It's nice to be here. My name is Margiana Petersen-Rockney, and I'll be presenting today some of our research from the same project that Michael was just talking about with Dr. Michael Poulsen and Dr. Christy Getz. So I'm going to start with a tiny bit of background. So you already saw this map, but since Proposition 215 back in 1996, local control has been a really key part of the cannabis debate and policy development in California. And Michael already explained that, 3/4 of counties and cities have banned cultivation entirely. And so what that means is, although the majority of state voters in California voted to approve Proposition 64 and legalize cannabis, now a majority of residents live in the state in localities where there's no pathway to legal permitting and legally growing cannabis. So for this presentation, I'm going to share some work from a paper that we're currently writing, which is really focused on Siskiyou County, one of those 4 areas where we conducted case studies. And Siskiyou County is in the Mid-Klamath River Basin in Northern California, up on the Oregon border. And it's one of the largest, least populated, whitest, and poorest counties in California. And prior to 2014, there was really no mention of cannabis in county records, despite talking to multiple, primarily white men who had grown medical marijuana in this medicinal county for decades without any issue. Then, starting in the mid-2010s, suddenly the majority of the county's governing capacity shifted to cannabis through ordinances, zoning amendments, budget allocations. They really started to focus on cannabis. And this sudden shift in resources and governing capacity to what the county called this out of control problem that threatens our way of life of cannabis cultivation, it really coincided with 2 things. One, of course, was legalization and the passage of Proposition 64. And the other was an in-migration to this region of Asian American farmers, many of them Hmong, into Siskiyou County. So starting in about 2014, Hmong farmers began purchasing small contiguous plots of land in several large rural subdivisions. And this is what those subdivisions look like. There are 4 in the county, each with over 1,000 1 to 2 acre plots that were previously mostly unoccupied. And these plots are dry with rocky slopes, and they were cheap with few houses. Most of the estimated 6,000 residents, many of them Hmong, who live here still live in campers and temporary housing like plywood houses. And there are no public services like paved roads or electricity or water, making farmers on this land especially vulnerable to the impacts of climate change, like drought and wildfire. And many of those early in-migrant Hmong farmers were elders, like Mr. Mua, pictured here. They're retirees who came to the U.S. as refugees and veterans of the U.S.'s secret war in Laos. Many had worked in factories in St. Paul or farms in Fresno and Arkansas. People described wanting to farm, to own land, and to live in community. The photos on the right here are of preparing food at a community feast when we were doing field work there last fall. But another set of visible potential water users, especially a group marked as racially and ethnically different, has been unwelcome by many longtime residents in the county. In addition to small livestock and crops like tomatoes and ginger, many Hmong farmers grow cannabis, which is locally banned. And farmers described growing cannabis as medicine to soothe injuries from the war and repetitive farm and factory work. Some people also sell this crop to support their retirement and maybe even send a little money home to their children or grandchildren to help them pay for college. And here I want to just emphasize that there are few crops that a farmer can turn any profit on an acre or 2 of very marginal land. But at the same time that Hmong farmers moved to the area, the county mounted a new governing response to cannabis. The county government banned cultivation in 2016 through an emergency declaration and asserted that this crop is not agriculture. They are not real farmers. And much of the county and media's rhetoric, both in terms of the discourse public officials used and public comments in meetings, leveraged anti-Asian tropes and environmental concerns. Government officials emphasized water use, wildfire risk, and pesticide contamination in connection to cannabis to justify targeted enforcement efforts. Officials used local policy tools like zoning amendments to destroy crops and created new fines and fees. The county also used new state groundwater regulations to sue farmers and Fish and Game Code to arrest farmers. The county found that rapidly changing cannabis policy and climate change anxieties created opportunities for innovation in land and water use policy enforcement. One of the early land use changes was passed in November 2017 when the county banned camping, even on someone's own private property, which was partly justified by wildfire concerns and what many residents and county officials described as a tool to cite people in the subdivisions, most of whom live in RVs or unpermitted plywood homes. And many had been waiting years to get building permits to build a permanent home. One Hmong resident who was not a farmer pointed out that white people can live off the grid and it's called sustainable. But when Asian people want to live off the grid, they are labeled as dirty criminals. They judge us all as marijuana growers. There's no surface water in the subdivisions, and most of the groundwater is contaminated with arsenic. Nearly everyone in the subdivisions has to buy water in. Water trucks fill from deep agricultural wells owned by several local ranchers. And many people store their water in above ground swimming pools like these. And local leaders like the Board of Supervisors and Sheriff have successfully built this broad and unlikely political coalition that leverages climate anxieties, especially around drought, and with urban environmental groups and agencies like the California Department of Fish and Wildlife. And county leaders then exercise their local discretion to innovate new water use code and enforcement strategies. In 2021, the county passed a series of water ordinances that banned moving water from one parcel to another, banned the use of groundwater to grow cannabis, and then banned transporting water on certain county roads. But what's really crazy is that they only banned the transport of water on the roads surrounding the subdivisions where primarily Hmong farmers lived. For the approximately 6,000 people living in these subdivisions, estimated 75% of them Hmong, they suddenly had no water. One Hmong farmer put it simply, saying, "Without water, we can't live." This water was not just for growing cannabis, it was for everything: drinking, bathing, watering pets and livestock, and irrigating kitchen gardens. These photos are of an unpermitted house that was abandoned after the water ordinances went into effect. They really did drive people out of the area. And this is what a citation looks like. And here I want to point out a few things. One, if cannabis is present, code enforcement can elevate the fines and allow them to begin accruing immediately without giving cultivators an opportunity to fix the problem. And these are often problems that you might find on any farm, like an unpermitted shed or an electric cord. Also, the amount that people often owe is huge. And to reduce the fine, farmers have to return the land to its original condition and remove all evidence of human activity, which of course makes the land not hold any value. And although Asian Americans comprise just about 1.6% of the county's population, we analyzed citation data that we retrieved through a Public Record Act request in partnership with some collaborators. And we found that over 70% of the fines under these three water ordinances were against Asian Americans, and 88% of the property liens that the county placed for unpaid fines in 2021 were against Asian American property owners. And this is what that data looks like, where we've redacted identifying information. But I want to point this out to show that column F is how we calculated race based on census data likelihood that a particular last name is Asian or Pacific Islander. And it's also important to note the timing here of the county's actions. In 2021 was the year that localities were required to submit their plans for reducing groundwater extraction under California's Sustainable Groundwater Management Act. And by focusing on estimates of water use for cannabis, then getting rid of the farmers growing cannabis, the county could meet state groundwater reduction targets without having to curb the water used in the region to grow an increasingly large crop of export-oriented alfalfa. And, which you can actually see being irrigated behind the water truck here. And while the sheriff estimates that cannabis was using about 2 million gallons of water a day in the county, alfalfa was using more than 400 million gallons of water a day in the county. And the use of water policy and climate and drought anxieties to target certain farmers did spark political protests, this one in front of the sheriff's building in 2021. And the ACLU and Asian Law Caucus filed a class action lawsuit against the county government for what many say is a pattern of racially biased rural water policy enforcement. And that case is still in litigation. But in the meantime, the farmers that we work with are struggling to survive and build a home here. As one older Hmong farmer told us, "My entire life I was born into conflict, searching for a home to make permanent. It is so sad that I'm still driven out from my home. I'm always forced to flee with violence." So I'm going to conclude here and with a couple thoughts, sort of takeaway thoughts. One is that bans create this uneven patchwork where farmers of the very same crop are treated like entrepreneurs in one locality and treated like criminals in another. Another is that rapidly changing cannabis policy and also rapidly changing climate policy are creating opportunities for innovation in both new policy development and enforcement strategies. A third is that while growing cannabis is no longer a felony in and of itself in California, civil regulation can also be extremely punitive and really life-changing for cultivators, especially when punishment approaches are leveraged immediately with high fines and fees and people aren't given the opportunity to learn or correct mistakes that they're making. And the final takeaway I want to emphasize is that racial disparity in enforcement persists, replicating well-documented disparities and inequities in the war on drugs. Thank you.